Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well as always. And so off the back of the last video, where I spoke about, well, I kind of named 10 films, didn't I, that I felt didn't belong in the IMDb top 250 films list, or for that matter, any top films of all time list. I said I was going to do a kind of a little bit deeper of a dive into my kind of history with and my issues with the IMDb top 250. So that's the Internet Movie Database, and the top 250 films that are rated as the result of kind of aggregate of user votes on the website. It's a list that's kind of gained a bit of kind of status, stature over the years by virtue of the fact that it's been around for, I don't know, between 25, 30 years now, the list, I think. And it's obviously something that constantly changes with more votes coming in from people, more users, and films obviously being released over time. So it's a list which, or I should say it's a website mainly that's used by, I think that's used by people who, or at least let's talk about my subjective history with it, with the site, I suppose, and maybe you guys can chime in as to your own personal history and if I'm on the right track here. But for me, it was something that, I think I said this in the previous video with the IMDb, where I named the 10 films that I think didn't belong on there, which, by the way, I can easily name another 10, 20, maybe even 30 more. So if you did like that video, let me know, and then I can always name another 10 and rant about the inclusion of those. But my history with it is, it was a site I used regularly when I was a young cinephile, when I was a kind of very, ironically, when I was a kind of very kind of pretentious, young, kind of wanky film nerd, which I still am in some ways, by the way. It hasn't completely gone yet, but I don't think it ever will. But when you really think you know everything as a teenager and stuff, and you're really passionate about cinema, that's the site I always used to go in and check on, and particularly the top 250 list. In fact, to the point that, I think I said this in my previous video, it was my actual homepage. So when I'd log in on my computer, my homepage would be the IMDb. And every once in a while, a couple of weeks, every month or so, I check on the IMDb top 250 to see what changes there are, new inclusions, films that might have dropped out, to the point where actually I used to print lists every few months and kind of chart which films had moved and which films had dropped. And, I was very, and I'd always be outraged about certain films that were rated over others within the context of what was included in the list. And I still am outraged and irritated to some inclusions and exclusions to some degree. But I think over time, when my kind of cinephilia grew and I became more aware of, I suppose, different films outside of the mainstream, right? And you kind of do deeper dives, and you kind of you watch more kind of random or offbeat films and more obscure films, and your kind of appreciation for different kinds of films develops. I saw less use in the site, and I got more and more irritated with it, and I saw the issues with it more. And so now it's like every once in a while I look at it just for a kind of almost like a reacquainting and reminiscence of what films are still on there, and I can kind of guess usually what kind of films drop in the list. And so I kind of wanted to make a quick video about my issues that I have, and I can boil them down mainly to two issues, and it's overrepresentation and underrepresentation. So what kinds of films or filmmakers, etc., are overrepresented in my view on the list, and what are underrepresented. And so those are that's how I want to tackle this list. So the first thing I want to say about in terms of what I think is really overrepresented on this list, remember it's a list of 250 movies, are superhero movies and comic book movies. Now, if anyone is acquainted with the history of my channel, you probably know I'm not the biggest fan of these, and I kind of tuned out of the superhero cycle of movies, 15 years ago, like seriously that long ago. And it's the area of cinema which I feel alienated from most based upon popular discussion. So popular cinema tastes, if they're on this side of the spectrum, I feel, and when people discuss about that in everyday conversations, whether that's in, I don't know, a cafe or a bar or on the street, wherever it may be, right? My taste is here. I feel like it's completely at odds, and that's where I feel most alienated from popular movie taste, is with superhero movies. There are 10 superhero or comic book movies that are inside the top 250. Now, you might say, okay, that's only what, like 4% of movies or whatever. But considering it's a very clearly, narrowly defined subgenre and category of movie, that's, to me, overrepresented. 7 of which, I think it's 7, yeah, 7 are inside the top 100. Can you imagine making a top 100 movies of all time list and 7 of them are superhero movies? That's a huge overrepresentation in my view. And I think a reason not to take, I mean, if someone did that, included 7 in the top 100, a valid reason not to take their list seriously in my book. And you know, a lot of them are the kind of the animated Spider-Man ones. I think they're all in the list. A couple of the Avengers movies, and of course Nolan's movies, which we'll get to him later. All make the top 250, and like I say, 7 inside the top 100. It would be as ludicrous, I think, as me saying I'm going to do a top 100 list and 7 of them are going to be disaster movies from the 70s. Because essentially what we're in the midst of right now is a superhero cycle, which will eventually die out. You know, it will. It kind of already feels like it's in its death throes. A lot of people are suffering from kind of the exhaustion of having overconsumed, or more to the point, superhero movies being overproduced and made. So maybe we're in the kind of death throes of that cycle, but there always seems to be something that pulls people back in. For example, Joker, which is in the top 100 of the IMDb, a movie I wouldn't have in there. You know, so who knows? But it just seems, you know, just when you think it's kind of dead, it kind of carries on in its kind of undead form. It feels like the superhero cycle never seems to end. Well, like I say, it's a subgenre movie. It's not like, you know, if you had 10 westerns in your top 100, a western is, first off, it's a hugely long-standing genre, but it's a kind of genre, it's a mainstay genre. It's not a subgenre. So superhero movies are kind of like I say, a subgenre of kind of the action, adventure, fantasy, right, mode. So I think they're very overrepresented, and all of them that are included are from the 21st century. Okay, so there's none from before the 21st century. So we're even talking about a specific time period of superhero comic book movies here. So that's one area of overrepresentation. The second one, and perhaps the most obvious one and the most troubling one, is modern cinema, right? So I've done a bit of stats analysis here. So from the 20s, the decade that we're in now, a decade we're just about halfway through, there are 12 films from the top 250 from this decade. A decade, like I say, we're halfway through, 5 years into, okay? From the 2010s, there are 44 movies from the 2010s. And there's 48, the most of any decade, from the noughties, the 2000s. 48, which I was surprised by a bit. I thought the 90s would take it, but the 90s comes in third, actually, with 40 movies, okay? And then we see this trend from here on where every decade going backwards, it's less and less. So the 80s, there's only 26 movies. The 70s, there's only 17, which, considering a lot of people say that was Hollywood's second golden age, and this list does privilege American movies, that's very surprising to me. In fact, it's a tie with the 60s, which also has 17 movies, only 17 on the list. The 50s has, this is what breaks the trend, surprisingly, actually. The 50s has 22 movies. It's still less than the 80s, but it's more than the 60s and the 70s. So that's interesting. And then the 40s, you only have 12. The 30s, you have a pitiful 5. And the 20s, you have 6. And then you have nothing before the 1920s. So to kind of sum that up, you have 104 films from the last 24 years, so from the 21st century, that make up 41.6% of the list, just from the last 24 years of cinema, right? You have 144 films from the 90s onwards that make up 57.6% of the list, that's over half, and then 170 from the 80s onwards, so 68%. So 68% of the list is made up of films from the last 50 years. Okay, the first 70 years of cinema makes up 32%. Okay, now I've kind of said, you know, as suggested by the title of this video, kind of the IMDb is the kind of, it suggests the kind of impoverishment of cinema. What I mean by that is these trends dictate, if you just went by the IMDb top 250 as a kind of guiding point of what cinema is representative of, quality cinema, and what it kind of should be or is capable of, the height of cinema and its achievements, to me it represents an impoverished cinema. Okay, and like I said, one way of looking at that is, again, the overrepresentation of a subgenre such as comic book movies, which is very, very narrow way of looking at film. And the other way, like I say, is the privileging of modern cinema. Because the implicit assumption here is that the further along cinema's gone, it's got better. Okay, so cinema's got better and better over time. And that the odd old movie is the exception, not the rule as to movie making being good back in the day. You see this a lot with reaction channels, actually, if you've ever watched any of the reaction channels, where a lot of them will react to movies that are in the top IMDb top 250. They kind of use it as a guide as to what's popular and therefore going to be a hit for their channel. But then what happens is they'll end up reviewing a kind of an older movie, right? Something from, my God, can you believe it, before the 90s. And if they like it, they kind of say this thing with a kind of proviso or caveat by saying, well, they'll say, oh, it's good for an older movie. I'm like, they're almost taken aback that an old movie has a level of craft and, you know, intelligence to it, or like I say, filmmaking magic. You know, it's actually any good, and it's a real backhanded compliment, isn't it? You know, to say, oh, for a film from the 70s, that's not actually that bad. And I think that kind of implicit assumption is something that the IMDb list is what gives that weight. You know, the reason why something like that is even said is because of things like the IMDb top 250, which, when you look at it, all these implicit things are there of filmmaking wasn't as good back in the day. These are the notable exceptions, but really, the 2000s is really where it's at and onwards. You know, so there's a real recency bias with this list, because of course, the kind of films that make it on here by virtue of the number of votes, they have to pass, there's a minimum threshold of votes that a film has to get in order for it to make the list. I don't know what that threshold is actually off the top of my head, but therefore that kind of implicitly privileges newer films, because, you know, what's new and relevant and, you know, in vogue and fresh on the minds of viewers, they're going to log on and vote for that film, give it a rating, it's going to receive more votes, and it's more plausible that it's going to get onto that list. Whereas people have to make an effort to go and watch older films. And like I say, if you're just starting out on your cinematic journey of watching different kinds of films, the IMDb is, like I say, it is a good place to start. It really is. But, and like I say, I'm not trashing the whole list. There's a lot of films on the IMDb top 250 that I cherish and love and would have on my own list, okay? But, like I say, it's the overrepresentation that's the issue, that you can kind of walk away from a list like that being self-satisfied, kind of knowing, oh, well, you know, I don't need to seek out older films because they're not that good anyway, because the list tells me that they're not, because it's all the newer films that are on here. So again, that bias is, I think, really harmful to perceptions of cinema. And like I said, I think it reinforces a kind of impoverished view of cinema. Like I said, to think that 104 films, so that's over 40% of the list, is just films from the last quarter century, or 24 years, not even quarter century really, is quite staggering, I think. So I suppose on the flip side, we can look at issues of underrepresentation, right? So if newer cinema is privileged, older cinema is way underrepresented, okay? So to give you an example, the first 50 years has only 45 films. Only 45 films. So not even 25% of the list is from the first 50 years of cinema, okay? So from the 10s, which there's nothing, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right up until 59, okay? That's shocking. That's a really poor showing, okay? And it just goes to show, you know, if you meet the kind of, even someone like a general film fan on the street, a lot of them have these barriers to entry when it comes to films. The amount of people I speak to, and they won't touch a film because it's in black and white. They won't touch a film because it has subtitles, which you can always catch people out on, because, you know, you could say, well, do you like Tarantino? They say, yeah. And they go, well, there's subtitle dialogue in some of his films, you know, Inglourious Bastards, for example. So did you like that less because it had some subtitle bits in it? Okay. And you'll always find the notable exception, like the foreign film, in terms of that everyone kind of loves anyway, whether that's Amelie, Pan's Labyrinth, Old Boy, Parasite is obviously a huge recent example. So, but these things operate as a barrier of entry to people until they're not. And it's that kind of, I suppose, that kind of ignorance, for the want of a better word, but where, yeah, people don't want to touch movies if they're subtitled, or if they're, you know, kind of about, you know, they're overly too foreign, or if they're too old and, you know, made in a certain time period, or if they're black and white or silent. All these things are just barriers of entry to people that stop people watching these films anyway. And so this, again, it's like a self-perpetuating reinforcement of these stereotypes. I think this list is that justifies you not having to seek these films out. And that goes to the next barrier, like I say, subtitle films, world cinema. Now, I thought it was going to be really, really low, and it is really low, the lack of films that are on here, okay? But I thought, my guess was around 50, and it actually turns out it's bang on, from my count anyway. 50 films, only 50 films, so 20%, not in the English language, make the list. 20%. So that reinforces the stereotype that basically American filmmaking's the best. That's what you should watch. And the rest of the world only makes up 20%. And, well, America / films in the English language, that could be Canadian, British, so on, make up the rest. And only 21 foreign films, again, so 20% really, make the top 100. Most of which are either Kurosawa or Studio Ghibli films. So there's, again, a very narrow idea of, if it's going to be a foreign film, it's a case of exceptionalism of, well, you know, that's okay, but we don't want to go too nuts with this, do we? Yeah. And in fact, that feeds into the last point that I want to touch on with this, which is directors. So I kind of focused on directorial counts when I was looking at the top 250 to see who appears the most. Okay, and you can kind of boil it down to about 7 or 8 different directors that make up a lot of the films on this list, actually. Probably well over 20-25% perhaps. And speaking of foreign directors, so Kurosawa is the kind of foreign director who makes the most entries with this list, with 6. He has 6 films in the top 250. So he's very, very well represented. But I feel like Kurosawa is like, he's the director where someone will say, you know, if they're doing a best films list, they include a Kurosawa to kind of appear more cultured. Like, oh, you know, I do watch foreign films. I do watch art house too, and older cinema. I'll throw in Seven Samurai, you know. And Seven Samurai, by the way, used to be in the IMDb top 10, I believe. Now it's not in the top 20. It's slid a little. It's at 22, and that's the highest foreign language film on the list. I think closely followed by, I think, Life is Beautiful, which, if you saw my previous video, you know how I feel about that movie. So, you know, and surprisingly, it's actually there's quite a lot of Bollywood films. Going back to my point about world cinema, there's quite a few Bollywood films. I think they changed up the formula 10 or so years ago, which allowed more Bollywood films to kind of get onto the list. Because that never used to be a thing. But unless more people that consume Bollywood films vote, I'm not sure. It could be the case, as the sites grew and grew over the years. But yeah, Kurosawa has 6 films on the list. The director there's a couple of directors that have a lot, which to me is anything like 4 or more, I suppose. Because, you know, 4 films out of a top 250 that's good going, right, for one director. Tarantino has 5, of course he does. Which, considering he's made 10 movies so far, right? I know he claims he's only made 9, but we won't go there. That's 50% of his filmography is on the list. Again, overrepresented, perhaps. Hitchcock has 6, I think, maybe 7. Which, you know, I think, is that an overrepresentation? I think any filmmaker has 6 or more is at risk of being overrepresented on the list. But that's not the worst. Spielberg and Scorsese both have 7. 7 movies at the top 250 on there. It's impressive, right? And Kubrick has 7 as well. Now, considering Kubrick only made... How many films did Kubrick make? 14? Again, 50% of his filmography is present. It's impressive. The most, though, the clear winner, is Christopher Nolan has 8 films on this list. 8 films out of the top 250. He has more films on this list than the entirety of the 1920s, right? Yeah. And the 1930s, actually. Crazy. In fact, he has 8 films on this list when there's, you know, if you double that, that's pretty much the entirety of output representative of either the 60s or the 70s on the list. It's crazy. I'm not the biggest fan of Christopher Nolan. And I think, you know, sometimes I do think it's some of my backlash is the result of this. Is his kind of his, I think, overrepresentation in terms of discussion with as to his greatness and his works in terms of cinema. Maybe there is some of that there, but I feel like that's kind of necessary to combat. I think his overrepresentation does need to be combated. You know, I think because I think a lot of people seem to equate Nolan as being the height of cinema, and I just so disagree. I really do. I suppose the new version of Nolan, Villeneuve, his cinema, he's got 3 on the list. I was actually surprised. I was expecting a few more, actually. So, but 3 already. You know, he's still a kind of, I suppose he's made quite a few films now. But yeah, he's another filmmaker who seems to be popping up all over the place with his popularity. The Dune movies have only obviously exacerbated that fact. So there are filmmakers on here that are clearly overrepresented. Even filmmakers that I have less of an issue with, say a Scorsese. I think 7's quite a lot, isn't it? Never mind where their placements are, because I have issues with some of their placements. But 7 of his movies, it's quite a lot for top 250 again. Even like 7 Kubrick movies. I mean, yeah, a Kubrick is, I suppose, maybe less of an issue for me, but yeah, it's again, it just goes to show how I think sometimes how it's not very broad, the IMDb top 250, to say the least. It's kind of narrow. Some might say refined, but I think refined's the wrong word. So yeah, those are some of my issues with the list. Let me know what you think, guys. Are you a fan of the list? Do you swear by it? Do you just completely ignore it? Are you unaware of it? You could be. Do you take any stock in these things? Like I say, the only reason I take stock in them is because they do tell us certain things about popular film taste. And I kind of tell us, I think, some of the issues regarding fandom and cinephilia, I think, and some of the problems and the barriers to entry for a lot of films, which I think is, you know, obviously it's not a level playing field, which is a shame. But movie culture is something that always has to be kind of fought and contested over and battled over, like all culture. So, yeah, it's all about getting those lesser talked about filmmakers and their films getting the attention they deserve, I think, sometimes. So, yeah, let me know your guys' thoughts, and let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, of course, like, comment, be a part of the discussion, subscribe to the channel, and as always, I will see you on the next one, guys. I will probably, like I say, maybe do another 10 movies that I think don't belong on the list. And, you know, who knows what next movie list I'll take apart, but I will probably do a series on this of movie lists, because I just find them really, really interesting. And let me know if you guys do too. And as always, like I said, I'll see you in the next one, guys. Take care.